Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Carenza Jennings. I'm a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, and I'm here today to welcome you. Thank you very much for joining us virtually. We are live streaming and recording the event, and thank you to everyone who's come here to be in the room with us. Now, just to let you know, for those in the room, we're not expecting any fire alarms today, but if something should occur in the next while, please just file back out and go round to the left and go back onto John Adams Street. So, today we're here to talk about UK skills, unprecedented crisis, or unique opportunity. And we've got some amazing people to hear from today. So we're going to eavesdrop on what I think is going to be an incredible conversation by two people who I believe are among the greatest thought leaders in the UK today. And the reason I say that is because they're not just thought leaders, they're not just thinkers, they're doers. They're used to turning their ideas into practical solutions and into policies. So we're here today to think about skills policy. Now, in the backdrop of possibly the worst economic crisis any of us have lived through, we have an unprecedented opportunity and set of challenges. We need to think about what do we want to do for those who are furthest away from opportunity, for those who are most marginalised in society, for those who are most disadvantaged. How can technology play a part in making a difference? Now, I'd like to invite each and every one of you in the room today, and each and every one of you watching from home or in your office, to have a think about your own learning journey. From around the age of 16 upwards, think about each of the stepping stones that have helped make you uniquely you, the skills and the talents that you have, and think about the stepping stones that have taken you to that place. The people you've met, maybe an inspiring talk that you've heard, the courses you've done, the opportunities you've had, the software and the hardware that have helped you along the way. And today we're positioning this as unprecedented crisis or unique opportunity. So I'd like to draw on the words of a great philosopher, Charles Mackesy, who has got many of us through lockdown over the last couple of years. Is your glass half empty or half full? Asked the mole. I'm just grateful to have a glass, said the boy. Now, I'd like you to just hold that thought today. Think about your own stepping stones. Think about the people that have inspired you, the incredible opportunities you've had. And even if you may have come from a very, very difficult place in your past, think about all those people in our country today who don't have access to opportunity, who don't have access to nutrition even. There are so many people who are really struggling. Those who are furthest away from opportunity are those that we're seeking to help. And I said that particularly Andy and Rebecca are two of the greatest thought leaders in our country today because they are used to turning ideas into policy. Ufi VocTech Trust, I've personally worked with them over many years, and they invest in the most incredible organisations. They help them along the way, they hold their hand, they help bring amazing ideas into reality. And some of us are going to have the opportunity to see that later today when we go to see the VocTech Showcase. RSA, I joined many years ago, and I'm hugely honoured to be one of their fellows. And if you aren't fellows, please do join. They're trying to turn incredible ideas into practical, actionable steps. So let's eavesdrop on this conversation. Please be mindful of your own stepping stones and think about that glass that we're all holding. Is our glass half empty or half full? We're grateful to have a glass. Please welcome Andy and Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carenza, for the glowing introduction, and thank you all for joining us today, both in the room and online. And I think you've asked some really significant questions there, and it's not just eavesdropping on our conversation, because we're also going to ask you to ask some questions as well. So it's eavesdropping and joining in a conversation, I think. Andy, as Carenza said, we've kind of got this huge economic challenge. There's a whole lot of things going on in the world today, and what I'd really like to explore as the first part of our conversation is what role does skills policy play in the solution to these crises? And I think for me a big part of that question is how do we adjust our skills approaches to cope with that changing economic landscape and those who are in danger of being left behind?
Terrific. Well, first of all, thank you, Karenza, for that lovely introduction. Gracious. We've only just met, but I feel we're going to get on famously. And to Rebecca, not just for being my paxman for the day, but also for being a collaborator with the RSA over many years. We hugely appreciate that relationship, and thank everyone for coming along to RSA House, to our home. You are always welcome at our home. I hope you join us, in fact, as a fellow. Thank you for the plug, Karenza. We might just start with the economic challenge that you mentioned, Rebecca, which Karenza mentioned. It is very acute, and it is of long standing. You know, the truth be told, UK PLC has gone through an extended period of pretty anemic growth. I know growth isn't everything, but times are tough when the pie is static. And for many people across the UK, the pie has been static for the better part of 15 years. The growth that we have had in the UK, if you decompose it, you can decompose growth in, if you're an economist like me, into two bits. Economics is really easy, right? Two bits to growth. You can either grow your supply of people, or you can grow how productive those people are when they go to work. That's dead easy economics, those two components. If you look at the drivers, the cylinders of growth in the UK since the global financial crisis, the second cylinder, the productivity cylinder, how efficient and productive we are in the workplace, has effectively flatlined throughout that period. We have not had a similar such period of stasis probably since the Industrial Revolution, right? And although there is no singular cause of that stasis in productivity and the accompanying anemic growth that we've suffered, I would argue the larger part of that does come down to skills deficits, skills deficiencies of their many and various types. I'm sure we'll get onto the many and various types of them. Problems of long standing, but problems made more acute by a chronic lack of investment, and indeed I'd argue a chronic lack of imagination when it comes to thinking about the skills landscape we need for the 21st century.
I think that's a really interesting point about the imagination side of it, because I think there's a big piece about that long-term plan, that idea of where you're trying to get to on that kind of skills and training landscape, and I think that conversation about skills as part of like the engine of economic growth feels like it hasn't been happening in the way that it should have done. Mm-hmm. And I think you and I have spoken before about that idea of societal kind of equity and access to skills, and actually you can't just focus on one part of the skills landscape. You have to make sure that whole kind of spectrum of skills is being addressed. Otherwise you end up with a kind of weight at the bottom that completely prevents that economic growth.
Yep.
And as you say, it's not just about growth, but actually we know that growth supports our kind of wider societal objectives and that idea of a kind of a just and fair society. And I think sort of in lacking that strategic vision for skills, you lack the opportunity to make a just and equitable society. And I think one of the questions I'd like to sort of to explore with you is a little bit about those learners furthest from access and opportunity. And do you kind of have a sense of are there things that you see that could be changed, that could start to address some of those challenges around either regional disparities or many of the other kind of blockers that we see that aren't just about kind of geography?
Yeah, a lot in there. Let me try to pick off one or two bits of it and do your deep question, I hope, a degree of justice. So in terms of what's at stake here, how big is the prize? Can we size the prize? I mean, for me, the prize here, the skills prize, indeed, it's in some ways it's the same as the levelling up prize. I mean, I've given a bit of thought to just of late. Comes in, there's two elements to it. there's a case for doing this brave new world of skills, on purely social justice grounds. That is to say, there is a large, very large, and rising cohort of learners, young and old, increasingly old, who simply have not had the opportunity to flourish. And by flourish, I don't just mean get a better job. I also mean have agency over their life, right? Because learning's worth doing, irrespective of what it does in job terms. It's not just about the jobs. So that unlocking of opportunity among those currently locked out of skills opportunities, skills building opportunities, is a huge issue, a growing issue, and one that on moral grounds, on political grounds, we can ill afford to overlook. But listen, even if you're a nerdy, hard-headed economist like me, there's a second rationale for this, which is the unlocking of the potential in people, that's today's agenda, and in places, that's the levelling up agenda, also grows the pie, in the language beloved of our previous Prime Minister. You know, the unlocking of potential in people and place is what generates jobs, is what generates income, and therefore gives us what we're seeking economically as well as from a social justice perspective. So it's a twin win, and that's why would be foolish to overlook the chance to both reslice the pie and expand the pie. There are relatively few things in public policy where you can achieve both at the same time. This happens to be one of them. In terms of how we might go about that, I'm sure we'll dig into this in a bit more detail. But to my sort of simplistic way of thinking, maybe it's because I've been watching too much Bake Off recently, which is true, by the way. I think of the skills/capabilities nexus in terms of three layers of the cake. All three of which I think have deficiencies right now. So that the base layer would be the foundational skills without which none of us will thrive, not just in the world of work, but just in the world. So most obviously that includes, of course, literacy and numeracy, something close to my own heart, and I see Sam, CEO of National Numeracy, here in the audience as well. It increasingly, of course, includes digital literacy in its many and various forms. The truth is, our current system or systems do a relatively poor job, even when it comes to establishing the base layer for a great many people. That's why, and to pick a numeracy example, we find, getting on for half the adult population not having levels of numeracy any better than that of a primary school child. That's a telling diagnostic of the foundations, in this case, numerical foundations of our economy being not as strong as we would wish. I've understated that in typically English fashion. Those foundations are non-existent for too many people across the UK. Base layer, the soggy bottom of foundational skills. The cream and jam, that is the vocational engine and the academic engine. The specific skills that we should be nurturing in our economy. Vocational, academic, we've done pretty well on the academic and pretty disastrously on the vocational as a country over roughly 50 years. The tide is belatedly beginning to turn in the vocational direction. We still have an enormous amount of distance to travel before we have anything like an equalization of those two dimensions. of the specific skills that we know are crucial in the world of work and beyond, particularly so in the 21st century. But the final layer of the cake, which is the one that perhaps attracts, for me, least attention, and therefore looking forward perhaps needs to attract much more attention, is something I wouldn't call it so much as skills, Rebecca, as capabilities. So these are the attributes in us as individuals that we know are crucial for mass flourishing, whether in work or outside of work. So it includes creativity and innovation. Even more important in the 21st century when robots are eating our jobs than in the 20th century. It includes resilience and tolerance as individuals. It includes empathy. It includes negotiation and management, and green skills and regenerative skills. These are often invisible characteristics, but characteristics that we all know are crucial in the world of work today, will be even more crucial in the world of work tomorrow, and therefore we'll need those invisible attributes to become more visible and actively, rather than passively nurtured, in many more people across the population.
I think that's really interesting, because you often hear people saying, "Oh, we won't, we don't know what jobs there are going to be in 20 years' time." But the reality is, there's no way we knew what the jobs we're doing now were 20 years ago. So that will always be the case as long as we carry on developing and innovating and growing. And the way we can help people to be able to deal with that kind of changing workplace and that changing landscape is to have those attributes, the kind of resilience and the creativity and the flexibility. And I think, but recognizing how important they are as part of that landscape of kind of training and skills and personal development is a key part of thinking about what that skills landscape looks like. And I think in some ways we get a little bit too hung up on what's a soft skill, what's a hard skill, what's a vocational, what's academic. But actually, if we step back and said, what do we as a society think that people should be equipped with when they come out of education, and then think about how we equip people, that's you start from the right question. And I think one of the things we want to equip people with is exactly as you say, the resilience and flexibility to be able to adapt, and confidence and motivation are key parts of that as well. I'm really conscious that from my standpoint, from a Ufi VocTech Trust standpoint, we also are really passionate about the use of technology in this whole process. So I really partly want to get under the skin of that. How does tech influence our thinking on that piece? Not least because, as you said right at the start, this is a long-term problem. We've been talking about skills gaps and challenges for people for a very long time. And we've been talking about regional disparities for a long time. And I think, one of the questions I'd like to put to you is there an opportunity that we have never had before because of technology and because of the tools that we have access to look at things in a different way and to come up with more interesting and hopefully more successful solutions?
Yeah. Again, lots in that. Let me try and... First, I completely agree with you. I mean, this hard skills, soft skills distinction makes no sense at all. All skills are hard because all skills are hard to acquire, right? And the deficits we're talking about, which is at least currently 10 to 15 million people in our workforce, who do not have the skills they need to do their job as productively and effectively as they might. And that will grow without serious, radical rethink of the landscape. Our existing set of initiatives, there are plenty of them. We don't lack for initiatives on skills in this country. And many of them are well directed. The problem is the totality of those initiatives is still, for me, at least one decimal point out when it comes to tackling the scale of challenge I've set out. And coming to your question, Rebecca, how are we to best meet that challenge? technology and digital must be part of the answer to that. If it is to be a big part of the answer to that, then at that foundational layer that I mentioned, then digital inclusivity and indeed access, as well as inclusivity, are going to be important. Lots of people don't have access to the digital kit they need to thrive currently. So of course that is a base layer without which all of this is pointless for those that most need it. Beyond that, I mean, the real potential I see here is hitherto resourcing numbers of teachers, numbers of schools, has meant that personalized learning was not an option, right? The tailoring of learning to individual learning needs at different points in the life cycle was never possible. Not enough teachers, not enough schools. Technology, AI, machine learning, now I think goes quite some way in freeing us from those physical and human constraints. It's now plausible to think about using digital technologies to deliver a fully personalized, fully contextualized learning journey for every individual in the UK. We're not quite yet there. I mean, I'm not suggesting we could do it tomorrow, but that as an ambition, as an aspiration, is now a realistic one in a way that's never previously been true in human history. I think we need those tailored learning journeys because we know that people have very different and distinctive styles of learning. The joint report we did last week was just about this, which is just how different people's approach to learning is. Historically, our singular style of education has suited the people in this room. That's why they're in this room, to be honest. You know, if you thrive in acting individually in an examination setting, you would have done well. And that's probably why you sat here. Certainly why I'm sat here. Just lucked out that the educational model suited my style of learning. We know for a great many people that does not suit their style of learning. But we had no means of meeting their needs, we thought. Now we do. And that's why I think tech could be genuinely transformative for a great many people previously cut out of the system for no better or worse reason than the fact that it didn't suit their learning style.
That's, yeah, I mean, I think that's really, as someone who is actually quite terrible at exams, I think that's very true. But and I also think there's something, I mean, we've obviously been working together on the Cities of Learning, which is, for those who don't know, looks at kind of the how tech supports learning within a particular place and how it kind of augments the offer that exists, but uses things like micro-credentialing to help look at pathways through different kind of skills offers. And I apologise to Tom if I've just butchered his definition. But the one of the things I think that illustrates for me is that idea of technology as something that can augment learning, and it doesn't have to be an either or piece. And I think one of the things that really frustrated me after the pandemic was the rhetoric that online learning bad, classroom good, and nothing in between. But actually, there are loads of things that can happen with technology that really, they don't just personalise in a kind of just for personalisation's sake. They actually kind of augment that relationship between a teacher and a learner. I was just sort of, I know it's going deep into the kind of minutiae of it, but I was wondering if you'd seen anything, or there's anything that you find exciting about that sort of that within that personalisation journey and the kind of technology piece.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're much closer to the front line of this than I am, Rebecca, but I do think that co-evolution model is just the right one. That it's not like tech's a perfect substitute for the personalisation, the in-person approach to learning. I think they should be seen very much in a complementary fashion. In a way, I think will be true of a whole host of professions in future, by the way. So, let's take medicine. So I think in future, much more of the diagnostic stuff that GPs, medical professions currently do, will be automated, will be a technological thing rather than a personal thing. Will that therefore sound the death knell for GPs? Of course not. It will change the nature of the GP profession. Some of the diagnostic stuff will go to technology. But when it comes to communicating the fruits of that technology, that's an even more important role for the GP. Interpersonal skills, if you like, will be at an even greater premium for GPs in this future. And the same is true of teaching and learning as well, I think.
I completely agree. It sort of changes the role a little bit, but I think I think that kind of takes us down a little bit back down your path of the idea of the capabilities and the top layer of the cake. I suppose in some ways you could say that on your cake you have some lovely icing and a cherry, and that's the kind of augmented use of technology. But I don't want to overstretch your baking analogy.
No, stretch away.
I think one of the things that you raised there is this idea of digital, the kind of the digital skills piece and the importance of that as a foundation, and that actually there are huge disparities in people's access either to the technology they need or the kind of the infrastructure they need. And I just wondered if we could explore a little bit about that. Those because very often they are one and the same in terms of learners who are hardest to reach and who are furthest away from opportunity. And I'd really kind of welcome some of your thoughts about how you see that kind of challenge of learners furthest from opportunity being addressed.
Yeah, so a couple of points on that. And actually the points flow from that report that we jointly published last week, which I'm now bigging up, and rightly bigging up, because it had nothing to do with it, but it was really good. What that report does, for those of you that haven't seen it, is explore the motivations among people for starting on a learner journey in the first place, whatever your age and whatever your background. And I'm conscious, as an economist, that probably too often I've viewed this through a very narrow prism. And that prism has been jobs and incomes. Of course, you should jump on the learning ladder, because that way your skills are augmented, that way your job prospects are augmented, that way your income is augmented. Hands up, who's against that? And of course that is an element, but to view that as the only element is wrong for a great many people. If the blockers or the barriers to people starting on their learning journey are often not just about that. The motivations are often as much about personal agency. So if I am to reskill myself on the digital side, I need some sense of ownership, right? Over wanting to do that. It's not being inflicted on me. I want a sense that I'm in control. It's also the case that I'm far more likely to climb on that learning ladder if others like me in my community are doing it as well. So as long as alongside the skills dimension of this, if you like, human capital, there is an identity capital or agency dimension to this, seizing control of my own destiny, and a social capital dimension to this. What are those around me that I know and respect doing? Are they doing this thing as well? I think that lens on digital, or indeed any learning or training, is actually really important. To think about what is it that encourages people to take that first step. Because we know, having taken that first step, you're so much then more likely to go up the next step, having got started. I think that's as true of digital as it is of any other dimension of skills, perhaps particularly so for those, how to put this, those that are a bit older, who have not been steeped in all matters digital throughout their lives, and are understandably cautious, apprehensive, scared even, of what it means to take that first rung on the ladder.
I think it's an interesting point about the kind of is there something particular about digital that has a different impact on different demographics. But I think your point about effectively what's that first step? What's the gateway into learning for people? And it does, as you say, come back very much to that idea of what was their motivation for learning. And I think another area that kind of is important to consider is that contextualization of both the learning experience and the learning offer, but also the helping people understand why it's useful, interesting, relevant, why it can help them with their circumstances. It may what came out of that report, but also what we've seen in other work is those drivers into learning are many and varied, and understanding that helps you to understand what the offer should look like on the other side. And for me, that's one of the things that excites me about cities of learning, actually.
Completely. You mentioned, I think you said relevant and useful. Fun is another dimension of this as well, though. In some ways, the best way to nurture a love of learning, or a good way of nurturing a love of learning, is if you don't realise you're learning, right? It's almost subliminal. And having something that's fun is a good way of getting people started. So, case in point, gaming, right? Gaming as a means of nurturing learning, and indeed a love of learning, I think is a potentially very productive sort of 21st century avenue. So I think back to, in my previous gig at the Bank of England, we were setting up a little education program for 8 to 12-year-olds. And thinking about how can we make financial stuff and Bank of England stuff interesting to this cohort, which is not straightforward. And what we ended up doing was buddying up with two partners, one of which was the Times Educational Supplement, which sounds like the sort of partner the Bank of England would have, right? And the other one, which I was particularly keen on, was a partner you wouldn't expect the Bank of England to have, which was the Beano. So it was a three-way partnership: Bank, TES, and the Beano. And the reason I mentioned the Beano is because the origin of the Beano was, of course, as a piece of fun, as a magazine. But actually, the subliminal reason was as a means of attracting reluctant readers, right? It was a reading device, but those reading it didn't realise it was a reading device. That's why most of the characters in the Beano are naughty characters, right? And that notion that let's start with fun and use that as a means into, in the Beano's case, reading, in this case, a whole range of skills, including digital skills, I think is a really productive tech avenue for us to think about more imaginatively. It
reminds me a lot of a project we had with an organisation called Play Lingo, and there it was all around literacy, but the idea was that the content was very adult in it, so it was horror, it was all sorts of things that you wouldn't get as a child, because often things that look at literacy can be quite patronising and childlike. Yeah. And it just reminded me of that. And some of it was, we were looking at sharing it with our trustees, and we weren't entirely sure they were going to be totally comfortable with the content, because it was interesting stuff. But that's the whole point, is that it's enjoyable for the user, and they don't feel talked down to. And I think actually your point about gaming is interesting, because there's gaming and then there's gamification, yep, which is more about that idea of how you use the principles of gaming to kind of encourage increasing pursuit of learning, which I think is another really fascinating avenue. And just one final thing on that, because we've been talking about it lots this week and I love it, which is our Game Academy is another organisation we work with, and they look more at what are the skills you get from playing games. So actually things like teamwork and communication, and they're often
Completely.
overlooked skills because it's seen as something that's just gamers locked in their room, but they're getting this huge amount of skills out of it. I'm also really conscious of time, and I've had the opportunity to ask you lots of questions, and I'm sure everyone else would like the opportunity to ask you lots of questions. So we have, we're going to take questions from the audience and also questions from our online audience. Because we're live streaming, can I ask you to wait until you get the microphone before you say anything, otherwise they won't be able to hear you online. So I've got two, so I'll take two from the room. I'll start with Louise and then the gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Rebecca. Louise Marston from the Resolution Foundation. I was really interested in the example of technology augmenting learning, or augmenting jobs in the case of the GP example, allowing you to do something better by having technology along the way. We know for a lot of jobs, technology isn't used to augment the job. It actually sort of in some ways makes it worse. It reduces your agency or your autonomy. It maybe reduces the skills needed to do the job. What changes do we want to see from employers and businesses to improve the skills landscape? And then what are the policy changes we need to see to support those changes happening?
Fantastic question.
Do you want to answer it? Too fantastic. Thank you, Louise. I'll have a first go, then you have a go, right?
Okay.
We'll share it out. So, I mean, you're right. So, at the dawn of each industrial revolution, we've had three now, roughly speaking, 18th, 19th, 20th century, there have been concerns in the early stages of each and every one that the next wave of technology would eat up jobs. And in each case, that's proven not to be the case, right? And the reason it's proven not to be the case is because we've skilled up as human beings to keep one step ahead of the machine. Oh, in the language that economists sometimes use, the lump of labour fallacy is a fallacy. Now, it's not completely out of the question that with a fourth industrial revolution in the 21st century, the lump of labour fallacy might not be a fallacy. That is to say, more jobs might get consumed than are created. I'm not saying that will happen, but it's not completely out of the question. And the reason is because how do we as humans jump one step ahead of AI? And I think there are dimensions along which we can. You mentioned social skills as being one thing that's going to be hard or hardest or possibly impossible for AI to fully replicate. But even if that's true, will that mean there's enough jobs to go around? I don't know. We genuinely don't know the answer to that. But to your question about, what is the responsibility of businesses and employers to try and keep us one step ahead of the robot? I mean, the starting point in the UK, as you know, is not an especially encouraging one. Because we sit towards the bottom of the league table when it comes to the amount that our businesses invest in training their, I think second bottom in the G7, aren't we? You might know better than me. I think second bottom in the G7. And falling, not increasing, falling over time. So it's partly that the level is too low, and partly the trend has been downwards rather than upwards. What might be done to remedy that? We need to remedy that. To have any hope of making good on lifelong learning, employers have to be a big part of the answer. All the great stuff that David's been thinking about and working about, not just recently, but over many decades, actually. What would it take? Let me mention one thing that's slightly general and vague, and one thing that's more specific. The slightly more vague thing is if you go to Germany, there is there a different social contract between employees, employers, and unions, actually. An understanding that even if people move on between companies, it's still your obligation, not statutorily, but sort of socially, morally, to invest in your people. Because there is some broader social good that comes from having a skilled workforce. And that same mindset, that same social contract does not exist here. Businesses will tell you, well, if I overinvest in my people, all that will happen is be poached away to someone else, and I will not get the return on my investment. And that's a collective action problem. We need a different social contract to solve that collective action problem among our employees. That's not a conversation we've really had in this country. We need to have that conversation. The more specific proposal, and it's no more than a little part, would be just to point out, this is a statement that will be obvious to many in the room, that isn't it interesting, in some ways even a little perverse, that when it comes to a company investing in a piece of kit, certainly in R&D, they are encouraged by our tax system to do that. So we have tax credits for research and development spending, for investing in kit. But when it comes to investing in a different asset called people, we have no such incentive. In other words, the tax system, our fiscal system, has a natural skew towards investing in machines rather than people, which, given that most companies, the vast majority of companies, so their greatest asset is their people rather than their printer, strikes me as a little peculiar. Now, there are countries around the world that have levelled that playing field. They've said, look, you ought to get the same incentives to invest in human capital as you do to invest in physical capital. And that feels to me like one way of breaking in to this question of how we could encourage businesses to do a better job investing in people as well as it turns out, as you know, currently British businesses are investing in either to a sufficient extent, right? With an investment drought alongside a tailing off in training spend. Nonetheless, we need to up our game on both with a tilt towards the human. Sorry.
My answer is probably I agree. I think I think one of the frustrations is that investment in people isn't seen as a kind of key business process in terms of the way we look at it. And I think it's exactly that idea that if you bought a piece of kit, you wouldn't then refuse to do any maintenance or look after it because it won't be with you for the rest of your life. And it's that same sort of, it's just a complete change in mindset. And I think your point about what the policy landscape could look like helps to set that cultural landscape or reset that cultural landscape in a way that supports the human, which I think would be hugely positive. I'm going to thank you for the question, Louise, and I'm going to go to a gentleman at the back.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Thanks for that fascinating talk, Andy. My name's Tom Buick. Just going back to that brief discussion about learning styles, as somebody that failed all of my O-level exams originally, and today I represent through the Federation of Awarding Bodies, the exam boards and the awarding organisations. That's quite a turn up for the books, but I'm also a student professor of skills policy at Staffs University. And I'm a huge fan of your work on skills over the years. I think you've rightly diagnosed many of the underlying problems of what economists also like to call the skills and productivity puzzle. I think you once rather eloquently described the challenges, Britain's skills challenges, as being the collapsed left lung of the economy. But if I could put it to you in terms of you were sitting a skills policy examination paper, and so far I think I've heard, again very eloquently from you, part one, which is the diagnosis of the patient of the problem. Coming back perhaps to that last question, what are the real solutions? I mean, you've hinted in that previous answer that we've got the investment drought, 23% fall in employer investment in skills since 2005. Would you be advocating, for example, to Sir Michael Barton, who's just been appointed today by the Chancellor and the Education Secretary, to lead our fourth skills reform review of the decade, starting with Alison Wolf, then the Richard Review, then the Audit Review, now we're on the Barber Review. the Andy Haldane review be writing about the solutions to this skills and productivity puzzle?
Yeah, that's a big challenge, isn't it? Let me have a. I'll not provide a. Couldn't provide a conclusion. But a couple of things. And one is about quantum, and the second is about going local. So the quantum point I've already touched upon, which is that, T-levels, good idea, right? Apprenticeships, good idea. Local skills improvement plans, good idea. Help to grow, good idea. These are all good ideas in a directional sense. Lifelong learning guarantee, good idea. Lifelong learning entitlement, good idea. These speak to the right direction of travel. The problem for me is one of scale. That in each and every one of those cases, and more besides, of all the long list of initiatives underway, that they fail to recognise and reflect the scale of the skills challenge that we face, that's been accumulating over many years. So that, for me, it's not that we have to do different things. In some ways, we've had too many initiatives rather than too few, and too many reviews done rather than too few. It's a question of sizing the challenge and then putting in place policies that are sufficient to meet that challenge, and that we have simply failed to do over a number of years. The second point I'd make, though, would be about the local element to this. That to think that any Whitehall department, or indeed any minister of state, would know exactly the right amount of medicine to administer at the local level is fanciful. So I do think a key part of this is the devolution and decentralisation of skills policy to the local level. Those LSIPs I mentioned, the Local Skills Improvement Plan, they've got all the right words in there, right? Local Skills Improvement and Plans. We all like those things. The question now is making those a reality in place at scale. That could be part of that new social contract, the different partnership that I mentioned earlier on, but led not from the centre, not from the Whitehall machine, but at the local level. Only at the local level is the information known on what skills are needed, including by employers, and only at the local level the incentives there to make good on those plans. So although it's by no means a full answer to your question, scale has been an Achilles heel of skills policy in the past, and lack of local decentralisation and devolution has been a second. So I'd start with those two and build out from there.
I think that's a really interesting question, partly because I think one of the biggest challenges with reviews is the fact that they keep being reviews and there's not a lot comes out the other side. So in some ways, I think a sort of follow-on from your question would be how do we make a review something that gets implemented? Because there were a lot of good things in those reviews, or some of them. Thomas, you're in charge of our online interface.
We do have a couple, thank you. First one's from Josh online. With an ageing population and more people staying in work for longer, how can we ensure that those late in life career changers can reskill when they need to? What is the key to improving the over 50s access to foundational and new skills?
Excellent. Should I go first?
If you're happy to, yeah.
I spoke actually at there's this thing called the Longevity Forum, which Andrew Scott, professor at the LBS, runs annually. I find it a fascinating event actually, because it combines discussion of the clinical dimension of this, the biology of aging, whether we can live 150-year lives or 200-year lives, alongside the sort of social science dimension, which is how do we make a virtue of the longer lives we'll almost certainly be living. Just pick him on one point, actually. So I like this fact. This is my dinner party fact. How do we even think about ageing? 'Cause the premise of your question was, we are an ageing society. And of course, in the way we typically think about age, that's true. So if you measure age from the time you were born to your last birthday, that's how we measure age, right? And in that sense, yes, the world has never been older. But if you measure age instead from your age today to the age at which you're expected to die, we've never been younger. And it's the second that matters economically. Not how many years you've done, but how many years you've got left. And on that front, the world has never been younger in human history. So the world has both never been older and never been younger in human history. And it's the second concept that matters most economically. Now, that wasn't a digression from the question, I hope, because that's relevant when it comes to how we make best use of what is now a huge endowment. Aging isn't a problem. It's a huge endowment. It's a terrible thing to retire. We should all never retire. Certainly not in a cliff edgy way. We might sort of, glide a bit, go a bit plural, but don't stop. It's awful. And that does mean making a reality rather than rhetoric of lifelong learning, finding a way of maintaining the skills and experience of those, say, over the age of 50, of which I am now one, is super important. It will require us to think about what unlocks that. By the way, this is super relevant at the moment. So we've seen, 500,000 over 50s exit the workforce in the UK over the last couple of years. In some ways, that is the reason, the most important reason, why we sit here today in the UK with the most acute staff and skill shortages we've possibly ever faced, right? So record numbers of unfilled vacancies. The lion's share of that is accounted for by the over 50s having exited the workforce over the last couple of years. We don't fully understand why that is. Some of it is an ill health issue, some of it is a lifestyle issue. Whichever which way, we need to think very imaginatively about how we get those skills back in to the workforce, and at least part of that is a skills question, or a flexibility question, or a training question. And that won't just be about the money. It will be at least as importantly about the agency and about the social capital dimension. So I haven't answered your question. That question was it Josh's question?
Online, there's been no response from Josh to follow up. So I imagine you've answered
He's
it well.
thinking, I know what he's done there. He's used a lot of words not to answer the question. That's what I'd be thinking as well. Anyway, I think it is the right question, and I think part of the answer speaks to our earlier point about the motivations of learning in that cohort.
I think, it's about the motivations, and also, as you say, we don't know exactly why, but what are the reasons that people have left? And I think looking at it over the next few years and seeing if that attrition from the workforce continues, because I think that is going to create an ever increasing problem for us.
Well, I mean, and it's all the more worrying and striking, of course, for the fact that, I mentioned earlier on that the two cylinders of growth, right? So there's the one that's about more people, and there's one that's about more productivity. And the second cylinder hasn't fired for 15 years. So all the growth in our economic potential over the last 15 years has come from more people until the last few years. So the over 50s were the largest single contributor to increased participation and therefore to growth up until COVID, particularly women. And that single cylinder engine has now gone into reverse, is what makes the current economic challenge the greatest it's been in quite some little while.
I think one of the frustrations for me is people often kind of talk about technology as not being appropriate to the over 50s, which, as someone very close to that bracket myself, I find a little bit patronising. But actually, I think that there's a big role for technology as well in thinking about how we kind of address some of those motivations and access and opportunities and flexibilities as well. So it's going to become increasingly important for every generation. I think I don't know. You have been nodding at me, Thomas. But I think we're kind of getting close to So one more question, and I think if there's a question in the room, that would be
Maybe to the front.
David. I'll come to David and then I'll go to the gentleman on the end, which will be 2 questions. So we're going to squeeze it. But David, and there's a microphone just on your.
I'll try and be very brief. Tom Buick talked about Michael Barber's review. It's the first time when Michael used to write reports for me. I've written one for him. So he might as well, if he could pick up learning and skills for economic recovery, social cohesion and equality, you can get it on the Labour Party website. It's far, far too long. And we didn't have the resource that any of the other reviews referred to had. There was just me and my assistant, Joanna Firth. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because people are writing saying we've had the reviews. Why haven't they been picked up? And why don't we put the joins together? Why have we constantly have the iteration of further education against higher education, vocational against academic, body of knowledge versus developing skills for the future? But my simple question to you both is, how is it that opinion formers over the last few years have taken such a disinterest in learning and skills, including, by the way, the leadership of the Financial Times? I find it absolutely staggering.
Thank you. I think probably we both do as well. It's been a deep frustration actually that it feels there's such an obvious connect between economy, growth, productivity, and society and skills, and yet it's consistently not being talked about. And I think that's been one of my personal frustrations. And I imagine you have a similar feeling about it, Andy.
I do. I mean, the optimistic, I hope it's not over-optimistic, reading of the tea leaves, David, is I hope we're at the point where that penny is beginning to drop of necessity, given the economic challenges that we're facing. You know, as long as we had a rising tide of people and a rising tide of productivity, perhaps this didn't matter or didn't have the focus it should have had. Given that both of the tides have now retreated, or at least have stood still for the better part of a decade, and we're seeing those skills and staffing shortages acute in every sector and every part of the UK, I'm hoping this might be the nudge to employers, to skills providers, to politicians, to economists to sit up and pay attention to a much greater degree. Certainly, our media is part of that, part of the solution, perhaps having been part of the problem in the past. And maybe it's just me looking, but I see a bit more of this now trying to creep in to editorial, much more than I've seen hitherto, and I think that's a fair reflection of reality, and I hope we can turn the tide on that.
Thank you, Andy. So, our final question.
Right, Fumbi from Speakers for Schools, and my question is: yesterday, the FEA released a report card which showed that, you know, for young people on free school meals, the gap has persistently remained the same for over the last 10 years, despite all the reviews and the changes that's been introduced. And last year, we asked 5,000 young people who got placements through us if they knew the local employers and skills they required. Only 35% say yes. So there is a big percentage of young people who don't know who local employers are or the skills they require. And even though they're digital natives, the educators, the employers, policymakers are not making them aware of these skills they already possess and what the workforce of the future will need. So what sort of nudge do you think we need to give to, to all these people who've got the levers of power to make young people aware of the vocational skills and career pathways available to them?
I think that's really interesting. And also, I think 35% sounds actually quite high, even higher than I thought you were going to say, because it does feel so disconnected, that landscape between what jobs are available, what employers are looking for, and the discussion around the skills that we're looking to provide our young people with. And I think that disconnect persists right across the country, and comes back a little bit to your question, David, about why is it not being talked about. Andy, what are your views on that challenge?
Yeah, so for those of you who haven't come across it, there's a really fascinating piece of research recently, just over the summer, came out in the United States from this Harvard economist, superstar economist called Raj Chetty. It's about social mobility. He has lots of previous work on social mobility, Raj, which is basically tracking social mobility across, in a very granular way, across different parts of the US, asking the question, why is it so different in different parts of the US? The significance of his most recent research, and actually Raj is speaking here next week, virtually, unfortunately, but tune in, is he takes Facebook data, metadata, I guess it's called these days, billions and billions of observations on the social connectivity of individuals in the US, and asks the question, can that social network help make sense of patterns of social mobility across the US? And concludes, through a battery of very, very rigorous tests, that not only does social connectivity really matter to social mobility, it matters more than anything else. In other words, it confirms what we all know, really, which is it's who you know, not what you know. Interestingly, because this Facebook is so rich, metadata, it's not just who you know, but where you met them that really matters as well. And I'd encourage you all to go away and take a look at Raj's work. The significance of that for your question is if we're looking one way, on the cheap actually, to look for ways to boost social mobility among those otherwise disadvantaged in the workplace or in schools, is to act on the social network, to act on their social connectivity. I would see this as being exactly in line with what you at Speakers for Schools do. And as you probably know, I've been involved in Speakers for Schools pretty much from the get-go, which is, in this case, connecting in otherwise disconnected schools you with speakers of various types. So you know what it means to meet an entrepreneur, a tech wizard, even an economist. Indeed, you augmented that most recently with your internship program, right? Which is getting people who would not otherwise dream in a million years of getting an internship at the Bank of England, say, to have an internship at the Bank of England, forging those social connections that we know are crucial in the world of work. And why stop at talks in schools and internships in companies? There's a whole host of things we could do that could reconfigure the social network in a way that would unlock the potential in people who lack only for someone to talk to or to have met someone who've been on a different life course than themselves. And that by itself could enable them to traverse a different life course than they otherwise would have done. So I think there's huge potential in reconfiguring social networks in schools, in companies, in a way that could unlock potential in people, as Chetty's work demonstrates only too clearly.
Thank you. I'm conscious we have to wrap this up, unfortunately. I probably could talk about it for hours, but and do, if my team will attest. But I want to say thank you to the audience, both online and in the room, for your engagement, and thank you to you, Andy. I'm not sure we've kind of completely resolved the problem, but we've definitely surfaced some key parts of it. And I'd really like to invite you all to join us downstairs for our VocTech showcase, where you will get to meet. We've got 15 organisations demoing some of the most exciting technology to help vocational learners. And we'll have lots more of the kind of vocational technology family in that space as well. Are there any more housekeeping bits I need to say, Thomas? Because I'm trying to remember hard, but I'm failing. So yes, I'd like to give a round of applause for Andy and say thank you all for joining us.